survey, I think what we're looking for there is going to require some staff time to do research into how many permits for
Right.
demolition have been issued
Exactly.
and what kinds of design review or exemptions we've done. So if you say today that you want to bring it forward, we could either bring it for September or October, depending on how much time that
Have
took.
to do. Okay, well, either, I would leave it to your judgment to determine if we can get it done in time for September, and if not, we could shoot for October.
Okay, we'll move it down on the list then.
Okay, anyone else before we go on? All right, so agenda item 6B, continued discussion regarding potential designation of city-owned historic resources. And this is a review of a full list of city-owned properties that would be considered historical, possibly.
Okay, so at your recommendation last month, you had wanted to see a full listing of city-owned properties. I believe that the two lists that you have, one from Glendale Water and Power and one from Facilities Management, is comprehensive. What I did was I went through each of these. I wasn't familiar with many of these properties, and went through Google Street View, or in some cases went to look at the places to kind of do a kind of another kind of pass through. A lot of these sites are places, kind of a wellhead that's just behind a chain link fence up in North Glendale or something like that. So what I did was found 6 additional sites that I'll show you some pictures of today that look like there are potential historic resources on them. What I think we need to do today is kind of just finalize a list that will consider the Commission's wish list of city-owned properties that look like they might be of interest in terms of designation, and then we'll set in process the staff movements at the director level to kind of reach out to the directors of all the departments that are responsible for these buildings to see if they have any issues with potential designations, if they're excited and thrilled about potentially designating the buildings. We've heard that there's general interest at this point, but we'll need to go into the details. So we can't necessarily expect that all of the buildings will get designated, but I think we'll get a good, a solid representation of what the city owns in terms of historic resources ultimately designated. So that's pretty exciting. I have the slides from last month if you wanted to refresh the sites that you had we had on the original list, and then I added the additional ones. So we had the El Miradero Gate at Brand Park. We also have Brand Park as kind of more of a cultural landscape on the list, which would include everything within the park, and that's one of the question marks for me. A lot of cities are reluctant to designate entire parks, but some cities have done it, and if we were going to do one park here, Brand Park would be an obvious candidate. But if we weren't able to do the park, I certainly think the Gateway itself is really worthy. Municipal Services Building, which has already been determined eligible. The old police building, which is going to undergo some renovations if it's approved to move city offices into the now vacant building. We have 4 libraries of historic interest that we looked at, and I think I forgot to mention the lower left is the Montrose branch, and there's also a fire station that's part of that. It's kind of a joint facility, so a single building has fire and library use. And then obviously the Central Library by Welton Beckett is on the list. We have the Glendale Heritage Garden Bungalow that was saved as part of the Glendale Garden, and then also the old Richfield Oil Station in Adams Square Mini Park. Rockhaven as the larger site. We have the Spar Heights Community Center. One issue at Spar Heights is there was a significant addition made to one side of the building, so there will be some questions about its integrity, but in a lot of ways it really looks very much like the building that was kind of built standing alone in Spar Heights before they started building the houses. We have this Art Deco substation on San Fernando Road. We have the Civic Auditorium, which also has undergone a number of changes over the years and may have some integrity issues that we'd have to look at more closely. We have Dunsmore Park. Again, this could be a designation of the entire park, though the park doesn't have any significant structures in it, but actually it does. It has one community building that is an early building that's actually an old sanitarium building Again, that's been altered a lot over the years, so we're not sure what its integrity is. But the walls themselves that Milton Hoffert built are definitely have their original integrity and are pretty interesting, not just for Glendale, but I think even regionally. And then Brand Park, as I mentioned, as a kind of a larger scale designation. From the list that I got from facilities and GWP, there were a few other candidates. I don't necessarily think that these are all necessarily good candidates. I wanted you to just look at them, though. The General Services Building, which is right over here next to City Hall, is where GTV is located, as well as the auto facilities for the police department and city pool cars. It's a nice little Art Deco building. It does not leap out at me as one of the most significant of the buildings we have in the Civic Center. I'm not sure that there would be a lot of interest on the city's part to have it designated, but I think we need to, include it in the scope.
Yeah, narrow it down.
What we're considering. I don't think when we reached out to department heads that we talked to Chief Scoggins from the fire department, but this is a really nice little mid-century fire station, and many cities do designate fire stations, but that's also been controversial in some cities, so we'd have to look to see if there was interest and do some more research into it. But of the fire stations that we have, along with the Montrose Library Fire Station, this is probably the one that's most interesting architecturally. Here's another joint fire station library, the Chevy Chase Branch Library. I'm not convinced personally that this is quite a candidate for the register, but we don't have a lot of buildings like this kind of 70s geometric architecture. So it's something that you should consider. We have this mid-century substation from the Water Department, or GWP, that is pretty much very plain on the sides, but has this very nice kind of mid-century facade. And this photo does not do this justice. These are all Google Street View photos. It's a little hard to get good images. But this is at the Western Reservoir on Western and Bel Air. And this is the little pump house that's kind of built into the corner below the reservoir. And it's designed to look like a little Spanish colonial revival house. So it's really an interesting structure, and it really does have that domestic scale, even though I've never been inside, but I assume once you go inside there's all sorts of equipment and could be of interest. And then finally, it had been suggested to me that Maple Community Center is of interest, and it definitely is of architectural interest. And what was exciting for me was finding out that Arthur Wolfe was the architect of this. Arthur Wolfe designed the courthouse across the street, as well as the County Medical Center up on Glendale Avenue. So he's definitely and he designed the Boy Scout headquarters also on Grandview. So he's one of the more interesting architects who was working mid-century in Glendale. This building has gone through a lot of changes, including early changes, as well as more recent smaller scale changes. So I can't say that we have strong integrity here, but it's something we could look at if the commission was interested. So those are the 6 new additions based on the full list that we've got for your consideration. And so I guess to move forward, it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts were, and if there were any things you would want to strike from the list, if there's anything that you can think of that's missing from the list. At this point, I don't even think we need to prioritize. I think we can just approach the different departments and say the commission is interested and find out what the level of interest is throughout the city.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you have any comments or questions for Jay?
I'm thinking that's a good way to approach it, I think, because then from there we can see if we have specific interest or priorities that aren't in line, but if they're willing to, then we could start from there with our own priorities, as long as they're open to the idea.
Yeah, I think the process would be if we get everyone excited and interested in doing this, we would generate staff or nominations at the city level. Perhaps we could reach out to the community to see if there were people who would like to volunteer to write nominations, turn into school projects for local students. There are a lot of interesting ways we could
really
possibly get people involved in this.
Yeah.
Is there anything you wanted to strike from this list? at this point.
Jay, you mentioned that sometimes the fire stations have been controversial. Mm-hmm. And why was that?
Partly because they have very, very special needs at fire stations, and they may feel that if a building's designated, they'd be limited in making changes to accommodate new equipment or new technology as it comes online. They also sometimes are already looking at some of these older facilities as being outdated, and they may be on a list somewhere to kind of be taken out of commission at some point. So we have no idea what the situation is in Glendale right now.
And to that point, I think it's an interesting idea to flag all of these, because when stations are considered to be outdated and then taken out of commission, they can often be salvaged and repurposed, and that's something that's done with fire stations quite often. Mm-hmm. So I think it's nice to have them on the radar screen, even if they aren't going to be designated. And mm-hmm. I'd also like to see, when we do go more public with this, or at least go out amongst the city departments, that maybe we've taken a crack at prioritizing and earmarking those buildings that have been defined either on a reconnaissance survey or a regular survey as national, state, or locally eligible, because then, some of them may be speculative, but some of them we actually have solid data. Is that on here?
No.
Is that? Oh, okay.
No, I haven't pulled
that.
Yeah,
that seems like
it's
that's
only
more
a few
work.
of these. The Municipal Services Building, Rockhaven, I believe.
Right, like some of the biggies are.
Probably none of the others.
City Hall is a landmark.
City Hall's already a landmark. We have 16 city-owned buildings are already on the register. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of following suit with the city's earlier policies. It's just been years since we've kind of looked at it again. So
I think it's a good list, and if we put them in priority in terms of significance and feasibility, and also even reveal some of the pros and cons, so we're kind of out in front of some of the discussion items that could bog the process down, that maybe there could be some comments such as questionable, or I don't know, just. Okay,
so did you want to develop priorities now, or just based on what's already been identified in the surveys?
Yeah, I think, well, what's your preference? Do you have any feelings about how prioritization should be handled, or that we should do it? Leave it up to, we will leave it to you.
Okay. So we'll move forward, starting to talk with the various departments.
Fantastic. So is that item closed now? We're ready to move on?
Yeah.
Okay. 6C is review of the reformatted version of the North Glendale Historic Context, which was reviewed at our last meeting.
And I've gotten feedback from several commissioners. We also got some nice feedback from the Planning Commission that they appreciate the context. And I heard from one of the commissioners who didn't speak at the commission hearing because it wasn't really as germane to the discussion as all of the other parts of the community plan, but he was very impressed by it. So I've incorporated Commissioner Vidor and Commissioner Morgan's corrections and comments. And I think at this point it's pretty much the final document that we'll be sending to City Hall. Commissioner Morgan pointed out that the picture that I had of the dinky was actually not a dinky, that it was one of the other cars that they used on the line. So he sent me some photos. So I just a few minutes ago put the correct dinky picture in. So
glad we got that squared away.
But that's why we have the expertise in the commission for these things. So. And Commissioner Morgan is not here today because he had a grandchild born yesterday, and he has just jetted off to go visit. So that's happy news at the commission.
He didn't take the train, huh?
Actually, he didn't tell me he jetted off. He said he had to travel, so maybe he is on the train.
Maybe he did. Okay, so now we can move on to thank you very much. And, I'll reiterate again that we were, at the last meeting, we had a great discussion, and we were really, really impressed with the quality of the work and the historic context statement and the community plan in general. But thank you all very much, you especially, Mr. Platt, but many other people who worked on it. It was really a great document, and I know will serve everybody well.
A big effort, so
Big
we're
effort.
happy it's drawing to a conclusion.
Right.
Because then
Sure
we have
you are.
4 or 5 other community plans
That's
to start
right,
working
yeah.
on. So.
Okay, so 7A, new business, is commission discussion regarding regulation of interior spaces of Glendale registered properties.
So I sent everyone kind of a memo format rather than a staff report with just some basic research that Christina Park and I did to see what other cities, both in our area and a few of the larger cities around the country, have done in terms of interior landmarks. And it turns out they've done pretty much what we do right now, which is not regulate privately held interior spaces unless they're what we call quasi-public, which means something like a building, an office building lobby, or banking hall, or a theater interior that can generally be easily accessed by the public. And courts have ruled that public access, even if it involves a fee, like having to buy a movie ticket or something, those spaces can still be considered quasi-public. So in practice, that's what we've been doing in Glendale for years. Our public buildings, and the Alex Theater currently is a public building. We've reviewed interior changes. The commission reviewed some work for a new curtain that hasn't been installed yet but was proposed a couple of years ago. Some new sound baffling equipment for when they have orchestras playing in the theater. So we've looked at those kinds of spaces, which we consider at this point public spaces, publicly owned space at the interior. We also reviewed the interior lobby of the Masonic Temple when that came forward, with mainly changes at the exterior, but they were also proposing changes inside. We did not have purview over any of the interior spaces beyond the lobby, though. And so that's very consistent with what most cities do. Los Angeles is the only city that we were able to find that actually does look at privately owned residential interiors even. They do it on a basis that I still don't quite understand, how they monitor, how these projects come to them. It's very confusing, and they're definitely alone in that. So ultimately, I think the recommendation would be for us to make things clear in our ordinance, which is not clear right now, and that's how Los Angeles uses their ordinance to kind of look at interiors. Because their ordinance is silent about it, just like ours is, it says these are historic properties. And the assumption is that means properties from the property line to the exteriors of the buildings to the interiors of the buildings. We, through our policy and our procedures, have never done that. We've never looked at the insides of these privately owned properties. What we could do is define it in our ordinance to define what is a public property, what is a quasi-public property, and what types of interior spaces might be regulated in the future. I think if the Commission wanted to take it further and really look at regulating privately held interiors, we'd be kind of going against the grain of current preservation practice. There's the idea of what's the public purpose of government-based preservation, and it's very hard to say that there's a strong public purpose in regulating an interior that the public doesn't have access to experience or understand. And there was a recent court decision that I think, I mentioned it in this report, Martin versus City of San Francisco, and that was a CEQA-based decision where the city was trying to use CEQA to protect an important historic private interior, and the court said that CEQA does not apply, and there was no public purpose in that. So that's it's not kind of a direct equivalent to what we're talking about, but it gives us a sense that a very recent high-level court decision kind of ruled against that. So I think it's really an uphill struggle or effort to do that, and I really question, even as a preservationist, I'm kind of conflicted about this because I'm like, yeah, the interiors are really important parts of buildings, but I still don't see that we can justify doing it. And I know the real question has come up in terms of these kind of more modern type structures which have the indoor-outdoor relationship, have large expanses of glass where you really have this important connection. And even though I appreciate that, it's still, again, really hard to single out a certain style specifically, where we would regulate one style but maybe not other styles. And then the thing to remember about these modern houses is that those expanses of glass almost always open out to kind of private spaces at the rear, where the street facades of the houses are often these kind of blank, almost windowless facades. And then when you have a house up on the hillside where you're looking out through at this amazing view through the glass, when you look up at the house, you're looking at it from some distance, so you really can't see the interiors. So I'm interested to hear what the commissioners think about this, and then we could talk about how to proceed. But I think really making the ordinance clearer would be a big step forward, because it isn't right now, and some city ordinances really are very clear about what they can regulate and what they can't regulate. And we're already talking about making a series of changes to our ordinance as well as to the Mills Act that we're going to have to take to City Council. So this would be the time, with your direction, to kind of include this on the list of changes that we might make to the ordinance.
Any questions or comments?
Well, it's definitely a challenging topic, but I think, it is going to be difficult in private residences to try to protect the interior as much as there's, beautiful tile oftentimes, or batch-shelter fireplaces, or elements that are, really contribute to the historic nature of the property that was designated. But I think I tend to agree with the priority of historic preservation should be in those public spaces that's more available to the public for viewing. And so I think the lobbies or banking halls, that type of facility, and protecting those where we can is really where the value comes in. So I think maybe just making it more clear that in private residences or properties that don't have public access would not be regulated.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to mandate anything. I think the whole issue of interiors is a controversial one, and obviously there's a legal precedent to not even go into that area, but I agree that the public and quasi-public, the definition of what that is and how one would go about selecting features or architectural details that would be included in the designation, and what types of structures and parts of a building that would involve. You mentioned a few lobbies and things of that nature, theater entrances. That would be great. I think the key here is the silence of the ordinance, and if we can get past that and get it out there and at least do something to put important interiors where the public is going to benefit from their preservation into the ordinance, that would fulfill the purpose. I'll admit that I'm a little sad that we can't look at interiors, but I realize that it's just a non-starter. So.
One thing we could do is, if someone came to us with a nomination and we all end up seeing the inside of the house and we're just astonished by what we see, if it's at a level that rises to National Register level significance, there's a program called conservation easements where owners can donate the right to develop the outside or any part of their property that they choose to a group like the LA Conservancy, where it's a charitable contribution. In exchange for that, they get a really nice tax deduction for their taxes for that year, and it can be spread out over a few years in some cases. So that's something, just through our educational outreach, we could tell someone, oh, this is an option that you have available, and that's the strongest protection. That's in all preservation, a conservation easement is the very strongest level that we have. It runs in perpetuity with the property. All future owners are bound by it, and it's monitored by the nonprofit group that accepts the easement donation. So that has successfully preserved some really important interiors in Los Angeles and in Pasadena. And then that would just be part of our educational work. It wouldn't be an official commission determination, though the commission does weigh in on National Register nominations ultimately. So there'd be a little bit of involvement.
Right.
Jay, would there be any way to retract that at any point, or it would be
Yes.
permanent?
It's a permanent donation. So the person making the donation recognizes that in some situations it reduces the value of their property, and they do that for a variety of reasons. Perhaps they just want the tax deduction for immediate needs, but most people who donate easements are looking to the future and thinking in terms of protecting important resources. And the reason it's at National Register level is because then we know, okay, these are significant interior spaces. There's something really special happening here, not just yet another really nice Spanish colonial interior. So.
And obviously, a conservation easement is something that a private citizen does. It doesn't relate to institutional buildings or city or government properties.
Yeah, it has to be, well, to get the donation, it has to be
right.
someone has to owe income tax. But
Okay, so how do we proceed then on looking at what we're going to do?
One more question.
I'm sorry.
In terms of private residence, if, for example, someone notices that they've got one element which is truly unique and very historic and might be possible to add that, would that be possible to be added onto the Mills Act contract? So, for example, to have one particular element included in the Mills.
Yeah, we have freedom in the Mills Act contract to do something like that. I think it would have to be voluntary on the part of the owner. I don't think the commission could say, oh my God, that's a beautiful fireplace, let's put that on the contract. If the owner, because a lot of people who do the Mills Act contract are doing it thinking about the future, not just about their tax savings. So that would be a possibility if we had someone like that. We could certainly, we have more flexibility with the contracts because it's an agreement rather than a law. So
I think the hard part about that, like you mentioned in your memo, was if you don't need a permit to change out, fireplace, surround, or some of those interiors, more finishes, then there's really no way to catch or protect when you may not know for years and years later until a house turns over or there's a tour or something. So it could be in the Mills Act, but it may be really hard to... Yeah,
with our new Mills Act policy where we're going to have the 5-year photograph cycle, if we had a feature, we would include that on the list of things that needed to be photographed. If we found out that someone had taken out their batchelder fireplace, that would be cause for canceling the contract if the city wanted to. So.
Good point.
So that's a possibility. So for now, we'll be bringing all the recommendations for the ordinance revision to the commission, obviously, before we go to city council. So we'll include the discussion of public and quasi-public definitions and what we're covering. And Tim Foy has something.
Oh, I'm sorry. With non-residential buildings, would you go beyond lobbies and into the interior of business spaces? I can remember questions coming up about bank teller booths, for instance.
Yeah,
does it normally work in most cities?
Yeah, generally not. We would say what a quasi-public space is, but then it would be case by case in the nomination. We would actually map out and identify specific character features at the interior as well as the spaces. And because we can't force a private owner to do that, I think we'd be able to exclude the spaces they don't want us to go into. Generally, it is those public areas, though. So it's the lobby of the bank, which would include the teller counter, but not necessarily the back of teller space. It's really case by case. But we have the ability to either, some cities do the entire space, and some people actually just identify the features specifically. In Santa Monica, there's a lobby where just the terrazzo floor in the lobby is part of the interior designation, but the rest of the lobby isn't. So I think we'll just have to go case by case.
And just to follow up on that, we would expect then that the nomination and the commission's determination when they consider the nomination would call out those features. So it would be known at the time of the hearings what those features are, not something that would come up later.
Yeah, I think what we would do if this is our policy is we would include in the designation report a floor plan, or interior elevations or photographs that are annotated in some way to identify all of the areas that are covered very specifically.
Okay.
And then the owner would agree to it, because if the owner didn't agree to it, we couldn't force the nomination to go through. So we'd always have owner consent and buy-in for any interiors that are privately held, quasi-public.
And then the paperwork that the owner has to complete in order to file their application, that there would be something leading them to consider that in the application verbiage, right?
Yeah, we could revise the application form to say, public, private, public,
Right.
We could say, are there any interior features that you are nominating along with the rest of the property?
Okay. Great. Okay, well, I think that came out rather well. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And we'll see what happens on the next round. Okay, so where are we now? I think we're on agenda item 8, which is the Planning Division updates and informational briefings.
And for that, I just wanted to fill you in where we are on our historic districts that are in progress. Rossmoyne is getting close. We still have a few DPR forms that we have to review. The consultants have revised the context. They've corrected the first 300 forms that we had a bunch of comments on within those, and I hope to get them the rest of the forms by the end of this week. We're still looking at a public meeting. The next step is going to be a public meeting where we will have mailed out all of the individual survey forms to the property owners or the people living in the houses. And we'll have a public meeting where everyone can come back and say, this looks great, you made a mistake, whatever happens. And then we're hopeful that we'll be able to come to the commission in September with that. That hearing is where you'll be reviewing the survey and authorizing the proponents to circulate a petition. And that's the final petition asking the city to designate the district. So it's getting close to the end of the process.
Last stage. Great.
And for North Cumberland Heights, we just the other day finished we're doing a staff-led update of the former Cumberland Heights survey for the North Cumberland Heights neighborhood. Christina Park's done a great job. She's kind of jumped into this and has really done a lot of work on it. And she just finished entering all of the data into the DPR form, so we're on the verge of getting ready to have those printed out and have the context updated. In this case, we're not going to be able to go to a public meeting as quickly because we're doing this at staff level, and we've mentioned before that we have to get some other set of official eyes to look at this. Mm-hmm. We're going to offer it to the State Historic Preservation Office, which said that they would look at it in lieu of us having to hire a consultant to do the peer review. So assuming all goes well with that, we'll have a free review.
Fantastic.
I don't know what the timing on that's going to be, but we're close to being ready to submit it for that. And then in Brockmont Park, the consultant who's doing this pro bono for the city is moving forward. So she's actively working on the survey. So everything's moving forward but we haven't heard from any new neighborhoods, which is very much okay at this point. Wait a little while longer.
You can wait a little while for the next slew to come in.
That's right.
Great.
So that was all I had today for the updates.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we adjourn, any last words? And if not, I'll adjourn the meeting. Yes.
I had a question actually regarding updates.
Mm-hmm.
Has the Masonic Temple gone any further on their renovation of the lobby or uncovered any of the mural? Do we have any updates with their work?
Yeah, I don't think they've started any work. They've gotten their permits through Plan Check, I believe, and or their plans through Plan Check, and I think permits have been issued, but I don't think any work started. Mm-hmm. They were waiting for a Noise Within to leave, and I don't know if they've completely vacated, so. But they're closed now, so.
Okay. And Commissioner Shire's question triggered a question. Is progress being made moving forward on the Sealy building?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sealy's very active.
Because I do see something appears to be in the works, but...
Yeah, you should. If you happen to want to get out of your car, they did a nice job. There was some damage to the green terracotta around the ground floor entries at the entrance, and they brought in a consultant who specializes in kind of kind of sculptural type repairs to fix the cracks, refinish the areas that were damaged, and then just clean the whole thing, and it looks really nice. So, but they're definitely moving forward.
Great. Thank you.
One more update. What about the house on Royal and Mountain?
I haven't heard anything. I haven't.
The setback, did that ever come back to you?
The setback?
We had given you and staff.
Yeah, and they
setback.
you might not be surprised, but they kept the garage in the position that they presented it, so, which was one of the options that we left them. But no construction has started there, and I believe I'm not even sure if they have their permits. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, with that, thank you all very much, and I'm going to adjourn the meeting.